Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Essie Lenchner. I'm the Assistant Director for the Institute for Regional and International Studies National Resource Center, otherwise known as IRIS-NRC. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today's event sponsors are the Middle East Studies Program and the Institute for Regional and International Studies National Resource Center. IRIS-NRC supports and enhances global awareness and inspires informed thinking about the complexities of our world. We provide resources and expertise to K-12 and post-secondary educators, students, and the community at large. The Middle East Studies Program's mission is to foster knowledge of the Middle East, including its past and current economic, social, cultural, and political developments. Middle East Studies seeks to facilitate teaching, learning, research, and public awareness of the diverse array of Middle Eastern languages, cultures, and peoples that make this region so unique. We will be recording today's event and sharing the link and digital resources in a post-event email. You will only show up in the recording if your microphone is turned on to speak. So feel free to keep your cameras on if you're comfortable during this event. And do enter questions in the chat throughout. We'll have the last 15 minutes of today's event for Q&A. Next, I am very excited to introduce our main speaker for today, Mr. George Butler. Illustrator George Butler reports on the ground from conflict zones, climate hotspots, and humanitarian crises. He uses pen, ink, and watercolors to highlight personal stories of resilience by slowing down and going deeper than the headlines. His humanistic approach is shifting how we think about the news. In August 2012, George walked from Turkey across the border into Syria, where, as a guest of the rebel Free Syrian Army, he drew the civil war damaged, small and empty town of Azaz. A decade later, he spent several days in the metro in Kharkiv, Ukraine, recording the lives of those that lived underground to avoid the Russian bombardment. These drawings can also be seen at the National Archive at the V&A Museum in London. Over the last 15 years, George has been commissioned to offer a deliberately slow alternative to the headlines. He attaches his drawings to the personal testimonies of those that he meets and records their resolve and resilience alongside the vulnerability of their situations. This has included a leprosy clinic in Nepal, a militia in Yemen, the mass graves in Bucha, a cesarean section in Afghanistan, the artisanal oil fields of Myanmar, and more recently, for The Guardian, documenting the aftermath of the earthquake in Turkey and Syria. So thank you all so much, and please join me in raising your hand for George.
Hello, everybody. I can't hear if you're clapping, so please don't. Very embarrassing. How nice to be with you all. It's 10 o'clock in the UK, so not my normal time for a meeting, but what a small world we now live in. And I am going to talk a little bit about my work. Thank you for the introduction, Essie. Starting in Ukraine, why I do it, why it's important to think about creative approaches to the news, artistic sensibility in a sort of modern, in the age of generative AI, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about Syria. I know it's been something that you've all been focused on, and it's something that I've spent the last 15 years looking at, trying to visit, walking into. Briefly living there for a few months this year, and I don't know, it's touched my heart, and when I think about that place it raises hairs on my neck, so I'm always relieved to be able to talk to people and share stories of those that I met, because part of the promise, I think, of being a journalist is to tell the stories in exchange for people being honest with you and with me. So I hope they make sense. We're going to have some time for some questions at the end, so please think of the most difficult ones possible, and I'll do my best to answer them. I'm going to share my screen. Does that look okay?
Yes.
Nodding. Thank you. I'll take nodding. My name is George Butler. I'm a reportage illustrator, which means that I use illustrations to tell stories, to communicate ideas, especially for newspapers. I have found that true humanity exists in the most vulnerable places. Those emotions, the pride, the loyalty, the fear, the love that we recognize at home and in our homes and in our workplaces exist and are visible more than ever in places like Syria and Ukraine at the moment, and yet they aren't always the things that we see on the front pages of the news. And my I guess my problem with the news or the media is that I think it fails us in that sense. We are easily horrified by the things that we see every day, and to the point of feeling helpless or even switching off. And yet, it's very difficult to gather enough empathy to react. So, my approach to that has been um, to be deliberately slow, really, to find to find a way, in fact, by accident to start with, because if I'd had a camera, I would have been diving around on the front line trying to get those defining photographs of the front pages, but I didn't. I was at art school and I had a pen and a piece of paper, and that led me really. It led me to draw instead of take photographs, and it became this fantastic and intimate handshake, if you like, into a world and to people that I would have otherwise never have known. So the primary focus of my work is to get into editorial, to try and put text and image alongside, to try and capture an audience for a little bit longer than a photograph might, to punctuate the magazines, the glossy magazines, with smart photographs in 4K or with, I guess, quite old-fashioned, basic, handmade line that I hope captures attention. This is not a new formula. We have been doing this for centuries. This is gassed by John Singer Sargent, which hangs in the Imperial War Museum in London, and we used it as a way, often as a way of in the Second World War as propaganda. But as we went back in time, drawings were used before photography was invented, and it wasn't just because we were waiting for photographs for the camera to become more efficient. It was because they engaged audiences, they better informed us, and they sold thousands of newspapers. This is a copy of the Illustrated London News, which started by Herbert Ingram in 1842. And I think that we've got a lot to learn from how we used to report. We have spent 100 years forgetting this uh, ancestral visual dialect, um, first recorded, well, in this instance, 25,000 years ago in Lascaux in the caves in France, and most recently found in Sulawesi, carbon dated 48,000 years ago. These are examples of narrative painting. They are um, early examples, evidence of communication. And I think they run deep within us, and I think we should use them in our news, even in 2025. I discovered this as a formula in Iraq in 2017 when I suppose I'd always forced myself into these situations. I flew to Mosul on a British passport. I got a 30-day visa on arrival. I was determined to call myself a journalist or a reportage artist, and I got embedded with the Iraqi Special Forces. They were called the Golden Division, trained by the Americans. They were going house to house, clearing ISIS from the center of Mosul. And I don't know if any of you remember, ISIS had kind of held the middle of Mosul, the old city, and they were holding it, basically everybody inside it hostage. And so there were trips to the front line and uh, to record. And uh, on that day, I was drawing on a rooftop. We were taken up, told to keep our head below the wall so we wouldn't get shot at. Um, this was a man called Ahmed. He was 25. That machine in the background is the laser point, which they guide missiles into wherever the dot points at. Quite terrifying piece of equipment. And I remember it because we were taken up onto the roof, and in front of me sat a general who was having a cup of tea and a cigarette. And on his right, there was a man firing a machine gun. And then there were these cameramen who were putting their camera on the wall, and the general would say 30 seconds, and they'd do this countdown 20 seconds, 10 seconds, 5 seconds, and there would be this enormous explosion. A missile would rip in from the sky. You get this sort of, in a way, this kind of beautiful mushroom cloud that we associate with the Middle East, the thing that we see on the 10 o'clock news, BBC, CNN, PBS, CNBC. You'd be forgiven for turning off. Um, and all the cameramen went back downstairs, and I was left sitting on the roof drawing a general, just having the last drag of his cigarette. And it occurred to me in that moment that there are many versions, many truths of war. And I think the one that I see as an artist is equally valuable when we think about some of the situations and think about how difficult and think about the fatigue that we feel when when um, when witnessing this. So it was with that in mind that that I don't know, that hasn't worked. It's with that in mind that I made my mission to be, I guess, deliberately slow, to be analog in a digital world, to um, to take time when I think other people were rushing past. And of course, this isn't always the case. All the brilliant journalists that I know and work with also take a huge amount of care and attention. But I first applied this formula of being slow, of sitting down with a with a pad and taking testimony in Ukraine. And I just wanted to tell one story from there before we talk about Syria. Um, this was a lady called Madame Olga, and I met her because I was drawing on the street. I was drawing a blown up bus, and these two ladies, Valentina and her friend, saw what I was doing, and they said, "You must come and meet this lady. We're delivering aid to old people in Ukraine who don't want to leave their homes because it's their last defiant act against Putin. Like they want to die in their hometowns where they grew up." And I was taken up to Madame Olga's bedroom, fourth floor of an apartment in Kiev, too frail to get out of bed when the air raid sirens went off, too frail to get down the stairs. And so she waited on the top floor, tucked up in her blankets. You could see just wrapped around her shoulder. And I remember she had a little Bible under her pillow. And in the first instance, she thought that we were there to take her away. And she was nervous that we were going to drag her out of her bed and take her somewhere safe. That was not what she wanted. And she was confusing Hitler and Putin. And she was almost completely blind and almost completely deaf. But our translator sat holding her hands in front of her face and shouting the messages to her. And in this moment of kind of extraordinary crispness, given her age, she said, "If you tell them to be quiet, I will tell you the story from the beginning." And she was born in 1923. She was taken to a collective farm with her father. Um, she survived the Holodomor, killed 4 million, which killed 4 million Ukrainians. Stalin's famine, as they refer to it. Um, and when the war came, she was taken to Germany as a slave. She worked for a Nazi family. She was fed worms by them. She escaped once with her friend, to be caught by the police again, returned to this little village. She later found out that she'd survived the British bombing of Dresden, which was of course completely flattened. Um, and at the end of the war, of course, not knowing what to do, she began to walk home back to Ukraine with a herd of cows, as she'd been instructed to do by the Soviet army. And she met her husband on the way. Um, got married, had 4 children, and lived another 80 years until I met her a couple of months before she passed away, before her 100th birthday. And I suppose if it hadn't been for the process of drawing, then I wouldn't have had the time or the kind of, I guess, empathy or the moment or the reason to sit opposite her and spend so long uh, drawing her face. I'm going to leave him behind. He's little boy, another little boy from Ukraine, uh, shot in the head in an accident, which killed his mother. And I met him about a month later after his second operation, when he was learning to walk, very uninterested in me. And I showed this picture to an audience a couple of months ago, and a man stood up and said that the colours on the bandage on his head reminded him of the tiny amounts of hope in every story. And since then, I've met Vladimir and his family, Stanislav and Viktor, his brother, again, and he's learnt to walk. They're still living in Kharkiv, uh, and it's crass to say that there is life after these moments, because I don't suspect it feels like that at all for them. But I take great, um, I get energy and inspiration from people that I meet, and especially people like Vladimir. So if we just jump countries and a couple of years forward in time, this is December 2023, probably the 10th of December 2023, the Umayyad Square in Damascus, um, a couple of days after the fall of the abhorrent Assad regime and his father's dynasty. Um, and suddenly it was a rare opportunity for journalists and photographers like myself, and artists like myself, to tell a good news story. And these were kind of jubilant scenes, euphoric scenes, guns being fired into the air, the new flag being waved all across the country, whereas before it had only been kept in the north. Um, and I should give a little bit of history. I first visited Syria in 2012. I guess I had a lot to prove. I think I was probably quite naive. I turned up on the border age 25 and thought that it would be a good idea to walk into the country on my own. Um, the border was open. I was waved through by a few Turkish guards. It was 4 kilometers. It was boiling hot. There was nobody there. The duty free was empty. I had to go looking for the person to stamp my passport, who was less than interested. And we walked through a minefield. I walked through minefields on either side of the road, and arrived at a door. And the only thing I could see below the gate was two camouflaged trousers and a pair of trainers. And I walked around the corner, and I was just surprised to see this young lad there, as he was surprised to see me. And he just pointed to the next outpost. And I walked in there, and I explained what I was going to do. And I spoke to a man called Abu Yusuf. And he paused for a second, and then, of course, like like always happens in these places, he just said in perfect English, "Of course, what do you want to do? Where do you want to go? Do you need a car? Do you need a translator?" And I was on my way with the Free Syrian Army. These supposedly terrifying rebel group were, in fact, incredibly welcoming, and wanted to tell their story, and therefore hosted me for a couple of days in a little town called Azaz. I haven't got that. This scene that I showed you at the beginning is a tank with kids playing on it in 2012, and this is a tank with kids playing in it, all very different circumstances. Um, But just to rewind a bit, because I think it will give context to some of the things that we're going to talk about. The current Syrian, sort of modern Syrian history is I mean, is a lecture series in itself. But at the end of the Ottoman Empire, in 1930, you had the formation of the mandatory Syrian Republic, and then later the Syrian Republic in 1946, um, and other significant moments. I guess 1948, the Arab-Israel war, which Syria took part in, and then I mean these are all footnotes for fairly significant events, but um, we are working up to the formation of the Ba'ath Party in 1963 and onwards, uh, I guess the most significant moment of modern history, which is um, Hafez Assad's beginning of his dictatorship in 1970 to 2000. And how best to describe that? Hafez al-Assad was an Alawite. They make up about 12 or 15% of the Syrian population, and they ruled uh, initially. I think it was always it was always authoritarian. It was always um, with a sort of firm hand. Um, I guess those older Alawites who I've spoken to recently, and possibly some of the other ethnicities, the Druze and the Christians there, would look upon those years, the early Hafez years, as kind of mild compared to what his son would eventually become. And but by the end, there were some pretty horrific. Um, well, at the beginning as well, actually, in Hama in 1973, the sort of famous massacre. But by the end, the dynasty and the dictatorship is largely kind of considered as 50 years of of horrific rule over a majority, by a minority of Alawites over a majority of Sunni Muslims who make up about 65% of the population. Um, So in 1994, Basil Assad, who was Hafiz's oldest son, was killed in a car crash. And this changed the course of history because he was the infamous older brother who was going to take over the regime from his father. He was already renowned as being pretty cruel. And once he was gone, um, Bashar, who was a doctor, speaks French and English. Wife grew up in England. Famously had an account at Harrods for a long time. He was tapped on the shoulder and asked to return to Syria to prepare for his sort of inauguration. And they amended the constitution because he was too young, and he won the referendum with something like 97% of the vote, which of course is a complete fabrication. And then everything that you see now in my rather crass history of Syria, everything that you see now from now on are stories of those who lived through that history and describe it better than me. So, starting with this a year ago in the Umayyad Square, uh, and I think the significance of these few months and of this year is that these are stories that have been told by people who haven't been able to speak for the last 20, 30, 40 years, too scared to um, go to work necessarily. Well, not too scared to go to work, but I met a man in a hotel recently who said literally all we did was walk out the door, walk straight to the office, do a day's work, walk home, lock the door, and hope and pray that we were okay in the morning. And there were lots of other like strange rules. You couldn't mention the word dollar. You couldn't be necessarily seen speaking to strangers. This was a like highly paranoid, highly aggressive regime. 27, I think 27 separate security forces all reporting on each other. Uh, Sorry, just admitting people as I go. Um, Also, endless police forces. This is if you think data is the way of controlling people, and that's something we're very conscious of now, then the Syrian government did it better than anyone. They had files on every single person. Um, Most young men that I met in those few months had at some point spent time in prison. Every single person you knows and someone who has died or they are missing someone. Um, the total in the end was about 500,000 people killed in Syria, 200,000 people disappeared into the prison system that we saw after the 8th of December in Sydnaya. But it's hard to describe just the sort of the expectation of those living in Syria, the mums, the sisters, the brothers who thought that their family and loved ones were still alive, and that when he was gone, that they might be released, only to find that these buildings were not big enough to house everybody, and that the system had murdered and disappeared them many, many years before. And that's so with this jubilation that I'm kind of stood and witnessed, there was also this moment of closure, a really sad moment to stop and face for all of Syria, and they are still going through that now. And it's easy, I think, to easy to think that because Assad is gone and because um, the dictatorship is over, that their life might improve a little bit. And the reality was and is that um, that isn't the case. Just because the regime is over doesn't mean that there's suddenly more food on the table or more work. They've got sort of structural and societal issues all the way through education, transitional government. The economy is on its knees. 90% of people live below the poverty line, which is about $2.2. Um, it's going to cost about £500 billion just in bricks and mortar to rebuild what's been lost. Um, so, without being too miserable, uh, this was a protest that I drew on at the end of March. A couple of days. I mean, this is. I think what I'm doing is starting with the most miserable, and I will try and offer some hope at the end. Um, this was a peaceful protest, which turned quite violent in the end. It was a couple of days after the massacres in Latakia. Two of the issues that face the current government, which is now run by transitional president al-Shara. Um, should I just talk a little bit about his sort of takeover, or is that not? Does everybody know about that?
Please do. I don't know about that. So I think we'll
Okay, well, I mean, it's sort of infamous and almost unbelievable, but al-Shara was a member of ISIS, and if I'm getting this right, of Al Qaeda in Iraq, and he broke away from them to um, eventually begin his organization in Idlib, which is in the northwest of Syria, called HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and I suspect they've run Idlib as a more traditional um, Sunni part of the country. Um, if you go there, you will notice things like more of the women are covered. You will notice huge Turkish influence. A lot of the economy is open to that Turkish border. They tried to infiltrate a lot of the sort of local councils and have their say, which is not wasn't always welcome, but it was. They also offered, in some instances, organization and proactivity, and tried to run kind of basic sort of economy and needs for the people that lived in the northwest of Syria. Part of the reason for doing that was because they were anybody there was completely cut off from the government in the south, and aid didn't get that far, and um, but they were also listed as a terrorist organization. HTS were by the British and the Americans, so there's a sort of conflict of interest there for everybody. Um, Last year, in the end of November, they marched on Aleppo, and I think the plan was loosely to have a fight over Aleppo and eventually control Aleppo and then consolidate and then move south. But such was the timing of the Russians looking elsewhere and the Assad regime was sort of on its knees that everybody in the military fled and all collapsed, and it collapsed in on itself. And they were in Damascus in 10 days with absolutely no idea how to run a country, uh, completely unfunded, completely under staffed, as it were, and they suddenly found themselves with the keys to the kingdom. And since then, they have been trying to stay in control for as long as possible, and they make a lot of they make a lot of I think one of the criticisms of them is they're not doing enough inside, but they are doing. They are committed, outwardly facing. They are committed to doing the right thing. Inwardly facing, they are not hitting the metrics that you might expect for a country that is intending to be free and fair elections, have a constitution. There's still a consolidation of power amongst um, al-Shara's sort of inner circle. There have been some pretty horrific well, very horrific massacres in Latakia and in Sweden. And if you are a minority Christian, Druze, Alawite, then you are very conscious of your future in Syria, and it's very unclear, uncertain as to what that's going to be. Um, this is a drawing that I made uh, in Damascus a few days after one of the massacres in Latakia, where government forces had responded to an attack by ex-regime forces at a checkpoint. And between them and um, some more Sunni groups who were affiliated with the army, I think is the kind of most sensible way of saying that. Um, they like overreacted completely disproportionately, lost control, put a call out to people to respond to defend Syria, and about 1,000 people were killed. Some many civilians, many also forces from both sides. And this was a peaceful protest to try and to try and stand up in Damascus and say that the lives of the military and the lives of civilians, whether Alawite or Sunni or Shia in Syria, were of equal value. And it was met with pretty, in theory, it started quite peacefully, but people, Sunni men driving around Damascus, found it offensive for anyone to be sticking up for the Alawites at this point. And so these little pockets of violence broke out. Someone started firing a gun, someone was chased through the crowd and beaten up. And suddenly you just got a sense of the tension that has been bubbling underneath and along in Syria for so long. This is a collective trauma that they hold and carry with them, and is impossible for any of us to really understand, let alone me as a sort of artist looking in on that. Uh, and it feels strange, I guess, to make a what is otherwise quite, supposed to be a good looking picture of such a difficult time. But I hope it allows a kind of way of comprehending or of understanding or just starting a conversation. I'm not asking you to make your mind up. I'm not trying to polarize. I'm just saying this is what I saw and this is the context behind it. And that's sort of the power of drawing, I think. Um, and then all the way through the drawings, and stop me when I talk too much, Izzy. Um, all the way through those few months I was there, I was interviewing individuals. This was a man called Salahuddin. He had been in Sydnaya. Um, he had fled the army, the Assad army, because he hated it, and he tried to escape to Turkey, but he didn't get that far, and he ended up fighting for a group of which there are hundreds, possibly thousands of different groups run by different people, all fighting sometimes each other, mostly the government from the northwest, and he there was a presidential pardon, and he was allowed to return to Damascus, and he handed himself in, and then he was um, taken into Palestine, which is the branch of the security, and beaten with one of those green pipes. In fact, he wasn't beaten. The man in front of him was beaten. He walked into a room where there was a bloke hanging on the wall, and the guy asked him whether he wanted to tell him everything or whether he wanted to end up like him. And he confessed basically to anything they asked him to because he was so scared, which is often what happened in these places. And then I suddenly realized that the face that I was drawing, sitting next to his mum, the scars, the missing teeth, were all the story of his time in Sydney. And he'd wanted to be a professional footballer, but now he walked with a limp. His skin was about 5 tones whiter than his brother and his father's, who hadn't been in this place with no light for so long. He showed me pictures of him before on Facebook, and there's this young, like, strong man looking at the camera. And now he kept his hood up and was inside, and he had great hope, but it was sort of etched on his face. And I guess I often wonder where he is and how he is. Um, these are other scenes of Homs coming back to life. It's just a place sort of badly picked on by the government. A famous massacre there in 2012 in the Clock Square, and then the areas around the Sunni areas in Damascus and in Homs and in Aleppo were just completely flattened by artillery. This is the market in the middle of the town, with a bloke called Zachariah, I think, actually selling oranges. Hasna, Hasna Issa, who became a friend of mine, and if you want a good reference for some Syrian information at the moment, she's one of them. She's a journalist, activist. Her husband left her because he accused her of teaching terrorists in eastern Damascus. She's in fact teaching at a local school. Um, he left her with 1-year-old twins, actually, I think, or he left her when she was pregnant, and she had to fend for herself. She went to the hospital for one day because she was so scared of being arrested as an activist, and eventually escaped. Her house was bombed. She eventually escaped Eastern Ghouta to Azaz, which is the little place I visited in 2012. And she created, as only Hasna would do, this fantastic news organization called what was it called? Akbana News. And she has 45 freelance journalists that tell predominantly women's stories about Syria, undertold, undersung, understated, of course. And she's a force of nature. And I got to sit with her and tell her story, and she invited me to her house. I met her father, I met her two kids, um, and like just sort of awe-inspiring people that um, take so much energy from. And, this man was interesting. Maybe I'll sort of finish on this one. I mean, I could talk about Syria all night, but I'll take some questions and I can always carry on after. But this was a man called Tawfiq. In 2018, the Assad regime you carried out a chemical attack in a place called Douma, which is just north of Damascus. It sort of looks as part of Damascus on the map, but it's considered a different town. And it hit his street. Um, his whole family and others, I think 42 of them, died in the basement because they ran downstairs when the artillery started, which is, of course, what you're supposed to do in artillery attack, unless it's sarin gas, which is heavier than air. And they suffocated. And I met Taufik on the street uh, in December. So this was 8 years, 6 years after it happened. And he described how he coughed so hard that his sort of eyes, he felt as if his eyes were coming out of his face. And they had this, you probably remember the scenes, they had this sort of system where they were trying to wash the bodies of children down in the medical center on the corner just to get the chemicals off them. Um, and as it got dark, Taufik invited us into his house, and I carried out this interview, and I sat with him and drew him. And suddenly I was aware of other people being around, and other kids were walking in and out of the room. And this is very common in Syria because so many families live together. But he explained that he'd remarried after after the attack where he'd lost his wife, his brother, and three kids. And 6 years later, he had three new kids, one of who was called Judy, sitting on his lap. And I carried on drawing for a bit, and then I looked up, and um, I realized that he was crying. And he said to me, even now, all this all this time on, I have to sometimes roll over in bed and cover my face so my current wife doesn't see me crying about my first wife. And I felt that just encapsulated everything about Syria at the moment. There's hope of new families, but there's great sorrow in the people that didn't get to see the 8th of December 2023. And there's money coming in from Qatar for wages. There is some great diplomacy going on. There's investment into housing, and yet transitional government, social justice for those who've disappeared, um, sort of balance of society for different sects and ethnicities is completely lacking. So there's great hope and also enormous complication. And I think the measure will be, can we get to the second anniversary to see if that holds a better future for Syria. And nobody deserves hope uh, more than the Syrian people. But I think we have to look beyond hope. I think hope is a sort of nice, slightly wishy-washy phrase that we use when we don't know what else to say. I think we need as much action as possible, and I think we need more than hope, faith in the Syrian people, and um, I'll leave it here. But I guess it's so easy to be cynical, and what making these drawings taught me was that really we should be following the lead uh, of the Syrians in their attitude. That they're the ones that will be rebuilding their country, and they don't need a hand me down. They don't need charity. Um, they just need a hand up, as it were. So those are my that's my call to action. Um, I'll leave it on a nice picture, not a nasty one, and maybe take some questions. Um, this is the Citadel in Aleppo. If anyone ever's ever been, I recommend going. It's beautiful. They're rebuilding the souk at the moment. Um, also selling those balloons, which you see all over the world, which I think is quite incongruous. Um, does anybody have any burning questions?
Yeah, thank you, George, so much for sharing these slides so we can see your work. And you just educated me on a whole lot of things, and I'm sure everyone else here feels the same. So um, please, everyone's welcome to enter their questions in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand, I can unmute you, and then you can answer your question, ask your question directly. Um, and I
Come
was
on, be
just
brave. Ask them directly.
Great. And then, sorry, I see that we have some questions here. I just wanted to ask first, and then we'll get to your questions. How do you handle the psychological and emotional toll of the work that you do? I mean, there's a real, I know you just talked about hope and the limits of that word, but connecting to shared humanity, which I imagine would be energizing, but also just seeing so much death. How do
Mm.
you think of it, and how has it maybe even changed how you think of your life?
Oh my God. Yeah, good question. I don't see that much death. I try not, I don't think that's my role, but I am in places where trauma is so uh s- so common that it almost rubs off. So you almost sort of it's almost catching sort of by osmosis, I guess. Um, I think that in a weird sort of way, I think that the art is a sort of therapy. It's a big open board. I get to draw very slowly. The person I'm talking to is usually explaining it to me in a way that is quite friendly. We're usually sitting in a safe place. It's normally after the fact. There is an element of being able to hide behind your drawing board, like there is being able to hide behind your camera. You ask professional questions. You go through the process of being a journalist and hope that uh, you don't get caught out by the emotion, but inevitably that does happen. And I think to answer your question, um, I think the drawing is a great tool. I think that being able to share the stories on behalf of other people is a really fortunate thing to be able to do. You know, we all know if we have a worry at the weekend on a Sunday evening that coming home and telling someone is a nice thing to do. And I get a great relief when I see photos of people like Hasna who took so much time to sit and talk to me and look after me that I get to tell you about her work. That, as I said, was my promise, I think. Um, it doesn't really answer your question. I don't have this sort of underlying trauma, but I think because I don't see these places like that. I see them as especially the Syrians now I've worked with for so long. Um, I feel sad and cross about their situation, but I don't feel sorry for them. And I think they would hate to be felt sorry for. And I think that is the difference, possibly.
I like that answer. That's a great
A sort
valid
of answer for
answer.
for the therapists, really, but I haven't. But I try and better verbalize it on here.
Well, thank you for answering. We do have several questions, and I'm going to do my best to share them with you more or less in order. So first, we have a
Mm.
question from L. Novenstern. Taking a photograph only takes a few seconds, while creating a drawing requires more time and may even involve an audience. Have you ever faced rejection while doing your work or experienced censorship from authorities?
Um, mm, good question. Um, I've never experienced rejection, but in Syria, when I drew that protest, I actually not true. I was chased out of a village in Romania by a bloke with a horsewhip once because he didn't want me drawing in the village. Uh, but more interestingly, when I drew that picture, of the protest in March, I stood on the street. I stood on a generator and I drew, and everybody, as always, came up and they looked over my shoulder and they asked me what I was doing, and it turned quite violent. And I eventually got down off this generator, and someone handed me a cup of tea, and I thought nothing of it. Um, but somebody had, and I remember them doing it at the time, had recorded me standing on the generator, and they had put it on Instagram, and they said, "Look at the Americans drawing us whilst we kill each other." And he said it in a particular accent, which apparently from Hasaka, which was supposed to be slightly tongue in cheek, slightly funny, but because social media is the kind of front line of news in Syria, there's no formal uh, news industry anymore, um, and because it's often so polarizing, like it felt as if the sort of Syrian world was piling in with their opinions, and they were like so cross. I mean, I wasn't American, and I wasn't, and I wasn't doing what they said they would I was doing, but it felt as if there was this it just to give a window into this very uh, difficult, sensitive situation whereby, as a foreigner, we shouldn't. They felt that we should like it. It's just a bit like a brotherly relationship. You can punch and kick and pull your brother's hair as much as you like, but it's the moment someone else does in the playground, um, they get beaten up, and no one's allowed to touch them. And that it felt like that this was their argument and their thing to put right, and why were we there looking in on them? And it was a very humbling reminder that that just sort of our presence as Westerners or as individuals um, is like a very it's a very difficult thing to get right all of the time. I mean, I've worked with Syrians now for 15 years, raising money for a little charity, and um, but it was important to be reminded that this isn't just something to look in on and and not acknowledge the severity of it, I think.
I'll be thinking about that long after today.
Social media reminded me of that, and then everywhere I went in Syria, uh, I was just sort of approached like, well, first of all, people would just laugh because I'm obviously blonde and very white and look completely different, and second, Lord, they would just come up to me like, "Oh, you're the artist," and it wouldn't be positive or negative, just like, "You're him," and then they'd carry on with their day. It was very strange, absolutely opposite of what I'd intended to be the focus of it.
Okay, so we have a great question from Mark here. Traveling physically between Iraq, Ukraine, and Syria, and your home in England, do your heart and mind actually return home with you as well, or do you mentally and emotionally stay in the said place?
I think they go with me, yeah. I think that I think that I think that I've maybe yeah, home is definitely in London for me. My family are here, my brother's here. It's a place I love coming back to. Um, but I do feel a strange comfort out of my comfort zone drawing in places where I am completely alien. I don't know what that says about me, but I felt in Syria that I could have spent years there, living in the old city, drawing and making my way around. I think as I get older, I think the homesickness, the kind of the loneliness becomes more of a thing. I think there's a real, I think being solitary is like a real is a young man's game. Um, and there's a very strange relationship. Maybe other people have this as an artist with being solitary. You set out in the morning and you don't want anybody to disturb you. so that you can just create. And then, but by lunchtime, you're desperate to have a cup of tea with someone because you haven't spoken to anyone for hours. And then the moment that they get there, you want them uh, to leave so that you can get back on with your work. And so there's this push and pull between attention and creativeness, and that's the same in my work. But I'm never alone when I'm working because we're surrounded by people talking.
You must be able to tune it out or concentrate pretty well, especially given that how long it takes to sketch these.
It's all part of it. It's got to be. It has to be part of it. This one
Mm,
in front of you, for example, was a man called Ahmed, and it was he looked after pigeons in his workshop because he said he didn't really like people anymore, and he just wanted to look after pigeons. And I thought this was a strange sentence, so I stuck around and did some drawing. And it turned out that his son was 12. Abu Ahmed, he was called. His son was called Ahmed. Um, had died in a mortar attack in Aleppo, and he said my son was my wings, and this was his sort of metaphor of I think as I saw it, sort of continuation and looking after something else when he'd faced such a great loss. So we talked about that a little bit, and
I'm glad you're
we
able
went
to
on our
share that
way.
story with us. Yeah, it is connecting. I don't know, I just wanted to say that these stories are very meaningful. Um, Let me get to the other questions before we run out of time here. Naveen has asked, when you're sketching in a conflict zone, how do you navigate the ethical responsibility of representing people's lives while also trying to remain true to your artistic vision?
Very good question. Um, I think that there's always well, first of all, I think artists are always tempted to draw the things that they know that they can make look good. So um, that and that has to go out the window quite quickly. Um, I think that the drawing for me has become the process has become more important than the outcome. Well, that's what I take solace in. So I know that if I sit and draw somebody, even if the drawing is bad of their face or their portrait, then I will still have that opportunity to tell their story. And I think that I think that the sort of ability to be expressive goes down with the importance of the story. So when I feel like I'm in a situation that is important to be accurate, then I become much more accurate and uptight, which is not what we're trying to learn in the life class and in art school. But I become kind of obsessed with the detail, making sure the text is right, making sure it's the right sort of tank or the right sort of gun or the right sort of prison cell. Um, and that's really hard to because a better drawing might attract more attention. But I guess that's the same with writing versus with journalism versus poetry, with speeches versus spoken word. I think the human element is equally important, but finding that line is the hard part.
Absolutely. Great question from Kinza related to what we were talking about earlier. Your anecdotes are amazing, and the stories you shared really reflect the unheard traumas and lived experiences of people in that region. I want to ask, what ethical dilemmas did you face when situating yourself on the ground as someone who might be seen as an outsider? How did you build mutual trust and navigate that insider-outsider dynamic?
I'm definitely an outsider in Syria, uh, an ajnabi, which is foreigner, which is something that you're called all the time. Um, I think it's to be navigated, but I think that there is value in. I still think there's that value in the outsider's view of somewhere like Syria. I think that I better understand what my audience wants, and therefore will relate to, and therefore I can communicate with them better. Um, I think that the outsider thing is to be embraced when you're working there. There's no point in pretending anything else. And news these days is gathered. not like in the old days of sort of William Howard Russell. Is that the right man? Yeah. When it was sort of one white bloke on a pony and 15 porters, and they went wherever they wanted and took the stories and sent them home and by telegram. In Syria and in Ukraine, you're only really as good as the local journalists and fixers and people that you meet on the street corner, and if they understand what you're doing and why you're doing it, and if you have permission from them to sort of move forwards, then that's when you get the good stories. Or that's the good stories come with, like, for me, with like a sort of sensibility and a care to tell them. So I don't think we should feel guilty about that. I think we should be very aware of it. Some of the best reporting, I'll give you some names in a minute, has been done by Syrians on Syria and Gazans on Gaza and Ukrainians on Ukraine, um, not by not by me or anybody else. So uh, I think there's value to both. I think it should be tipped in favor of those who have lived it, but I don't think lived experience gives authority when it comes to journalism.
I think ask the last question here from Jean. Did you speak English with everyone, or did you need a translator? I think you needed a translator, but we'll hear more. And have you learned any of the Arabic used in Syria? And wow, your
I have,
collage is beautiful.
thank you. That's nice. I have learned some Arabic. I had some lessons when I was there. I have lessons twice a week at the moment with Thousand. And I'm learning Levantine Arabic or sit with Syrian dialect, which is, I suspect, hysterical to anybody else who speaks Arabic, but I'm trying. And yeah, as I said, only endless translators in Ukraine and in Angola and in Syria. Um, Normally, we're trying to get them as not only translators, but also translators from in Syria, particular towns, because not that many people have moved around. So they all speak Arabic. But if you want somebody who knows Aleppo, then you need someone from Aleppo because people from Damascus probably haven't been there for 10 years. And same in Hasaka, same in Salamieh, same in Homs. Um,
There are different dialects, like very different dialects around Syria.
Not so much dialect, yeah, but very different accents. Not so much different dialects. No, they all speak Syrian Arabic, but it's more just the knowledge of that place and the moment that they notice that your accent's from Sueda and not from Aleppo is the moment that they're suspicious of your translator as much as they're suspicious of you. So, whereas if you have someone with an Aleppo accent in Aleppo, the paths are smoothed and doors are opened, and there is a security issue with security implications with having fixes from the right places. Uh,
It's a
and
fascinating
just
detail I
again,
wouldn't
just
have thought of.
reiterates the kind of sensitivities of that place. Assad, this is Assad's, just to end up where we started, this is Assad's legacy. He drove the country apart to mistrust each other and took all of its money. And anything that you see happening now is the trauma left over from how he behaved and was so aggressive and cowardly. And um, that is that's to be remembered. We don't need to blame Syrians there at the moment. We can and we should point the finger at him for a long time. And I think that will make it easier if we think of it like that.
Well, thank you so much for enlightening us today. This has been fantastic for sharing your work, your art, and this is not easy work to do. And I really, really appreciate you sharing these anecdotes and stories with us and connecting us to the lives of these Syrians. We have lots of
There's
heartfelt
one
facts.
name that I'll give you, but then I'll give you some others later. And there's a podcast in the UK called The Rest is Classified, and it's spoken by a bloke called Dan McCluskey, who was a Middle East correspondent, not correspondent, researcher for the CIA, and he's now doing this podcast. And he's also written a book, a fiction, which is fiction called Damascus Station. But the rest is classified about Syria is a very kind of reasonable and balanced brief history of how we got to where we are, um, which I recommend anyone to. I thought it was interesting.
Excellent. I'll include that as well as links to your website and your published articles in the post-event email, which will come along with the recording of this event. So thank you so much, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Mark.